So anyway, at this time, I'd like to turn the talk over to Professor Girard. Jeff, they're all yours.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate being here, and it's a great display. It's just wonderful out there, and this is we need more things like this. This is great. We tried to do, as part of the regional archaeology program, we tried to do a lot of public interpretation, but we didn't have places like this to do it. So this is, you've got a really a good thing going here. This is great. Let me clear up one thing with archaeology, and I think this, people in their heads, they don't understand exactly what that is. It doesn't have anything to do with dinosaurs. We don't describe those are paleontologists, and what we do is we study human things, and basically we look at the objects that people discard through their lifetimes and the ways they alter the landscape. And that produces what we call the archaeological record of the past, as opposed to the historic record, which is just written documents. But by studying the material things like we do, we can go way back before there's any written record of what's going on. So we can study human history way, way back. In fact, 12 to 14,000 years of history is here in Louisiana. And it's just an immense span of time that it's hard to even fathom that much time, but that's what we're dealing with here. I've just put a little chart up here just to kind of give you an idea of what that's like. 10,000 BC, which would be about 12,000 years ago, start what we call the Paleo-Indian. And then there's a whole long span of time, the Archaic period, when people basically are just hunters and gatherers. They're not living in villages, they're not growing corn, just this very long period of time. And then they start doing, in the Woodland period, villages, and then it gets a little more complicated with the Mississippian period. And then look, the historic times, it's just a little tiny narrow band. I mean, we're just the tip of the iceberg here in terms of the human past of this area. Going way back, we'll try to go through 12 to 14,000 years, but I don't know if it gets bogged down here or something. That's okay. If we'll keep this informal. If you want to throw out a question as I'm talking, that's fine. I don't mind that. It's not a real formal thing. But the earliest evidence we have, we call Clovis points, or these Paleo-Indian points. They're really big stone tools. Some of them are quite large. They tend to be made out of cherts and flints. That's the kind of, if you saw Larry speak earlier, the kind of stone that they were making these things from. They're made out of stone that isn't found around here generally. They're very high quality materials. We only find a few of them in any given place. You'd never find a whole bunch of them all together. And we think it was very small groups of people that were moving around the landscape very frequently. And it was a whole kind of lifestyle which there really aren't any modern analogs to. There's nobody who does that today. They were a very rich environment. But they weren't living in one place and didn't have settled village or anything like that. And the groups were small. In terms of the past, the Paleo-Indian, sometimes you'll see in the older books and stuff that they'll call them big game hunters. It's because they lived at the end of the Pleistocene period. That's the last of the ice ages. And so the climate here was very much colder. In fact, it was like boreal forest. I mean, it was fir trees and things that we only have up in Canada now. We're down here in Louisiana. And then there was the Pleistocene animals, the Pleistocene fauna, like the mammoths and the mastodons, giant tapirs and camels and things that are just died out after the climate became warmer. In a few places they have found Paleo-Indian points with some of these now extinct animals. And so they got sort of the name big game hunters because they thought they were hunting them all the time. Well, we now think that's probably not the case, that they had a wider variety of food types. They were hunting other kinds of animals, smaller game, and they were probably fishing and gathering some wild plant foods and stuff as well. Part of the reason we think that is that it's difficult to kill mammoths and mastodons. They're basically were elephants. And as we were talking about earlier here this morning, a charging elephant, a guy with a Clovis point would be no match for a charging elephant. Clovis points can penetrate the hide of an elephant, but you can't throw a dart or you can't throw a spear hard enough to actually do that. So they would have to get very, very close to the animal. And some people, there's depictions like here that the elephants, they drove them into boggy environments. But elephants don't go into boggy environments, and they're very, very strong. They can get out of boggy environments. And if it was that boggy that had trapped an elephant, the guy would never be standing on the ground there. He would be sinking too. So we don't think that they actually hunted these things very frequently. They once in a while, yeah, but it isn't human predation that's responsible for the deaths of all these Pleistocene animals. It was just climate change that went on. During that long Archaic period, we find a lot of the tools that you'll see out here in the cases we call arrow points sometimes, but they're not really arrow points. They were points that were put on short spears or darts. And they were also used as knives, as cutting tools and scraping tools, and so they're probably multi-purpose tools. And we have a general idea of some of the changes that those things went through time. People ask me, oh, how old is this? And you can, sort of look at the general trends and say this is probably so many thousand years old, but it's not very precise. It's a little bit difficult. They were not, these folks were definitely throwing these spears, but they didn't have the bow and arrow. These things, most of those points that you find that are an inch or longer were not tipping a bow and arrow. They did not have that. What they did was they used a throwing stick called an addle-addle. And that's what this guy has here. It's a stick with a little hook on the end, and you just put that little spear, and it acts like an extension of your arm. And you can throw that spear much, much farther and with much more force than you can just by hand. If you go out to Poverty Point here, go way out almost to Vicksburg, out that way, there's the Poverty Point site. They have demonstrations often of people throwing these, and they even have contests once in a while. And some people get very good. They can hit a target at 100 yards, without any problem once they start throwing. I've tried it, and the thing just goes straight up. So it's not easy to do. But people did this for thousands of years. That was the weapon that they had. The earliest sites that we have are kind of like the Paleo-Indian sites. We'll find a few more tools together. It looks like the groups were a little bit larger than they had been in earlier times. But then at some point, and here's an example of that from about 6200 to 5400 BC, there are larger archaeological sites that are situated in places where there's multiple resources that are together. And by multiple resources, I mean like, in this case, this is Loggy Bayou in Bienville Parish. You have the flowing water of the bayou there. You have a cutoff channel that would have been a slack water sort of environment. And then you have the uplands right next to it. So you have upland sort of animals and plants and marshy plants and flowing water plants all together. And here we've got more than we've had in the past. One of the things at Conley is the earliest human burials. We never find burials from earlier, but here there's multiple burials that they put in one place. There's also these big pits that they dug in the ground and threw their trash in the pits. Whereas earlier you just get trash scattered all over the place. It was filled with animal bone, just loaded with animal bone. A lot of fish. And so what these people are doing, they're eating deer, they're eating fish, and they're gathering wild plant foods, especially hickory nuts. Hickory pecan, that was a favorite food, but other kinds of, just the whole run of types of fish that are around today. They were getting everything, especially catfish. Some of the catfish were huge. You can tell from the bones how big the catfish were. Some of these things were really monster catfish that they were eating at Conley. The other interesting thing about this site, Conley, is this is the site was actually in this gray layer you see here, and it's below. It is almost 15 feet of alluvium of river deposit on top of it. Most of the sites that you see, and the reason that we find these points, we find them up in the uplands. And we find them, where do we find them? Well, right on the surface of the ground, just by walking around. It's because there's been no dirt that's come in to bury those things over the years. And when that happens, the people who were out there 6,000 and 7,000 years ago and dumped a point there, it's the same place as somebody who came along 1,000 years ago and dumped their stuff there, somebody who came along yesterday and dumped their Coke can there. It all gets mixed together. But on the Conley site, it got buried. It got buried about 5400 BC. And we think that the waters, this is a tributary of the Red River, the waters backed up, the change in course of the Red River backed up water from the Red River, because we could tell because of the red deposits on top of it. And it buried that pretty quickly. And so that just cut it off so nobody else could come in there and dump things on it. So we have a nice little time capsule there. And it also sealed it, and it gave us preservation of things that we don't normally get preserved, like bone and stuff. Usually bone in the acidic soils we have here in the uplands deteriorates real quickly. But we got all kinds of bone preserved here, so we know in detail what these folks were eating. So there are very few sites like that.
Have y'all opened it yet?
It's what?
Have y'all opened it?
Yeah, we've done some digging out there, and then the Corps of Engineers, they thought it was important enough. They came in there and they rocked that cut bank there of the Loghi Bayou and preserved it behind there. And we do that because we know in the future, we know today we can do things with our archaeological techniques that people 50 years ago couldn't do. We've got better techniques, and we know in the future, we're counting on the future to even get better. So we want to preserve as much as we possibly can in situations like this, so that it'll be there when things get even better.
I've got a question.
Sure.
That picture before, you showed that skeleton is found facing south. Is that any significance there, or?
No, there were at least 3 burials we had, and they were different. One of them was some of the archaic burials are flexed. The knees are brought up, and they're in a small little pit. This was extended. This, by the way, is a young woman, probably in her 20s, the physical anthropologist, and there were fetal bones there. She might have been pregnant when she died. Some of the bones you see are missing, and that's mostly because there was rodents and stuff that ran through there afterwards. Really, preservation is amazing. One of the things that's interesting is that it wasn't in a pit. It wasn't like somebody dug a nice big pit and put them down there. Just in the trash there. Just the burials were just kind of in there at the surface. So there wasn't like a cemetery area of the site, another area. Now through time, our archaeological sites get better organized. Now I'll talk about that, but some of these archaic sites, it seems like they're campsites that people are repeatedly coming back to. So they're not doing the same thing in the same place necessarily each time. So things just sort of get jumbled together on the site. About 3700 BC, another weird thing happens, and that we get the first mounds. Here we have these hunters and gatherers, and all of a sudden they're building mounds. And you would think the first mounds might be little tiny things, and then through time it might get more and more elaborate. No, some of the first mound sites we have are some of the most extraordinary sites. It's just like, bam, out of nowhere they're starting to build these elaborate sites. One time, hunters and gatherers were thought to be, there's a philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, said the life back in the old days was nasty, brutish, and short. They thought that hunters and gatherers were people who just lived day to day, barely eking out a living, always on the brink of starvation and stuff like that. But anthropologists went and studied some modern hunters and gatherers, and they all live in very marginal environments like the Kalahari Desert in Africa, and some of the Aborigines in Australia and Eskimo groups. These are, modern hunters and gatherers, and the food resources are pretty thin in these environments where they are. They work 3 days a week, maybe. They sit around doing nothing. It's not that they didn't have time. Somebody called it the original affluent society. They just didn't. They don't need a lot, or they don't want a lot, so they subsist fine, no problem. So it isn't that all of a sudden people started growing crops like the story we used to tell is, once they started living in villages and growing crops, they had the time now to build more extraordinary things. That wasn't it at all. These people were just hunters and gatherers. They had plenty of time to do this. But why would they do that all of a sudden? Or it wasn't really all of a sudden, but over a period of years, they started building the mounds. Well, we think it's this. The population is getting bigger, and some of these groups are getting bigger. So when groups are starting to bump into each other, and what you need is a means of communication. This is just passing information along. And you do that by, think about it, you don't have any writing going on. Everything is through oral. All information is just oral transmission. You're just talking to people. And things that become sacred and traditional, you can't just do that through casual conversation, or it's not like teaching somebody to make a stone tool. That really sacred traditional information needs to be done in a formal ritual setting. And I think that's what's happening as you get more and more people together, and these people are starting to form alliances with other groups. They start to build these places where these rituals take place, and it becomes in Louisiana, here in the northeast part of Louisiana, we have the earliest mounds that are found anywhere in North America, right here in northeast Louisiana. The Watson Break site is Watson Break is just south of West Monroe, not very far. It's on the Washita River. And of course, a little bit later, we have Poverty Point. I'm not going to speak a lot about Poverty Point. It was just an incredible, elaborate place, not just with mounds, but with these earthen ridges. Dr. Diana Greenlee, who's the archaeologist out there, will come and do a presentation sometime just on that, and there's so much to tell. So, but anyway, it is one of these. It's at the tail end of the Archaic period. One of the most interesting places on the World Heritage List. It's one of the most interesting places in North America. After about 1000 BC, things start to change in that we start to get evidence of settled villages. The first evidence that we have of people building structures. Before, in the Archaic period, we don't know what kind of houses they lived in. They were just camping mostly, and so any type of shelter was probably very ephemeral. It was just little windbreaks and things like that. But now they start putting posts in the ground and building actual structures. And they also start making pottery. And pottery is great because once you make a clay pot and you fire it and it breaks, those broken pieces of pottery stay in the ground forever. They don't deteriorate at all. I mean, and so we get it preserved. And when you start getting into this time period, you find broken pieces of pottery all over the place. And the other thing they do is they decorate the pottery. Say they put little incised lines in it. When the pot is still wet, they take a stick and make little lines. The Indians here did geometric things. They didn't depict people or animals or anything like that. It was mostly just all these lines and little holes they put into it, and sometimes put red pigment on it, like you see over here. This is from the Marksville site down in Voiles Parish, the town of Marksville. It's a state commemorative area that you can actually visit. But some of them had these bird heads on it. And I don't know if you can see that, but there's these long-necked birds that are depicted. They're probably raptors because they've got hooked bills. But they're depicted in a very abstract manner on these pots. And what's interesting about this is these same kind of designs also show up in the Midwest in what they call the Hopewell. You might have heard of the Hopewell mounds in Ohio and Illinois, but there's connections between people for long distances. They're not just local people anymore, they're somehow connecting with others very far away. Just some more examples of some artist depictions of the Marksville site. There's some elaborate burials there too. Now you get the burials in the mounds. And those archaic mounds, there's nothing in the mounds. They weren't living on the mounds. We don't know what they're for. But in the Marksville period, they're putting burials of very obviously leaders, because there's just a few people in those burials. Here's an example of one. This is the Bellevue Mound out near Bellevue in Bossier Parish again, but it's a mound that's still in wonderful condition. Just a big dome-shaped mound. In this case, it's the only one there. It was excavated back in the 1950s, and it was found that there's like a little platform on the bottom of the mound, a little clay platform, and there was a flexed burial on that, and some hearths, and some post holes in the bottom, like there was a post in the ground kind of structure. I'll show you that a little bit more. Then beginning about 700 or 800 AD, you get arrow points. Now you get the bow and arrow. That probably changed the way people were hunting, the patterns of hunting. But they were still doing the same sort of thing in terms of doing a lot of fishing, a lot of deer hunting, also small games, rabbits and squirrels and things like that. But they were also beginning to grow crops. And the first corn comes in. And this is about 1000 AD. So we're way up here now to almost 1000 AD. And they're making, definitely the Caddos were making structures of various sorts and living in sometimes pretty big villages. So things have changed quite a bit. Just a little depiction of the important foods. And the ones on the top are by far most important. Deer, hickory nuts, and corn. And that was really the things that they really subsisted on. A bunch of different types of fish too. They were incredible fishermen all over Louisiana. Fish has been important forever. Other riverine things like turtles. Also these oily and starchy seed plants they used. And here's an example: goosefoot, knotweed. They're plants that are now weeds, basically. They're disturbed ground plants. When you disturb ground, sometimes these will colonize real quick. But the seeds are either starchy or they're oily based. Sunflowers are a good example. I should have put sunflowers on there because sunflowers are part of this group. They were eating those too. You know, you can eat the sunflower seeds, and people do it as snacks, but you can also grind them up and make a mush out of them, a stew out of them. So these oily and starchy seed plants were there as well. And you don't have just minimal gardening. I mean, you don't have to do much in order, those things will grow anywhere. In terms of the housing for the Caddos, we know quite a bit about it from both historic records, because these houses continued to be built into the 1700s when we do have history records. But also they put posts in the ground, and you can see, like, here's a reconstruction that they did over in Texas. And this is the actual excavation where they found the outlines of these big circular outlines of the posts. So they would put these posts vertically in the ground, and then somebody would there'd be a middle post, somebody would get up on top of that middle post, and they draw in the side posts and tie it off at the top, and then cut that center post out, and that's where they put the hearth of the house in there. And then they would put horizontal stringers around there, and then thatch it with grass, a thick kind of grass or split cane. And that's how they did that. Of course, you know, they have a hearth in there. These things often caught fire and burned down. Bad for them, but good for us, because what it does is it leaves a dark stain in the ground if that post burns down into the ground. And here's an example here of two that were right together. One's been excavated, but you see that circular dark stain. And that's how we know where those houses were, is because of the burning. Yeah, that's a good question. They had certain kinds of stone tools that seemed to be digging tools, adzes, and there's some things out there that they call celts, these polished stone tools. And they were probably used as digging tools, but it's not easy to do. You know, it's not easy to do when you don't have a metal shovel or anything. Water transportation also was extremely important. They made dugout canoes. We don't find them very often. The reason we don't find them very often is because they didn't abandon them at the places where they lived. They probably just abandoned them along the river, so they either get broken up or today we don't even recognize them as being parts of canoes. But in a couple of cases we found them in the Red River near just a little bit north of Shreveport, and the Caddos had immense canoes, 30-foot long canoes, like across this whole room. I mean, if you can go into the State Exhibit Museum and see the one that was done in the 1980s. That's this one here. And then a few years ago, about 5 years ago, I guess now, we found another one out, and it's identical to the first one that was found. And it was even longer. It was 10 meters long. It was about 33 feet long. Obviously these things were very, very important water transportation, because you think about it, they didn't have horses, they didn't have any wheeled vehicles, carts. You know, if you wanted to carry something from one place to another, you picked it up and you carried it in your hands or on your back or something. The only exception would be on the water, where you had a vehicle on the water. That's the only place you had a vehicle. The houses, they didn't live in, when I say they lived in villages, the villages weren't real compact things with one house right next to the other and streets and all that sort of thing. They were dispersed over like several miles along the landscape, and the first explorers described this as well. This is a map that was done as early as 1691, probably up near Texarkana on the Red River, but it shows a Caddo village. A guy actually, one of the Spanish guys drew this. They're on both sides of the river, and he shows little houses that are in little compounds, you know, just maybe a house or two houses, little gardens associated with them. He even put a little mound. They still had a mound in this village over on one side. In the uplands, it would have been around here, something like this. You probably would have been like on Bayou d'Arbonne or something. You would have a scatter of houses along the stream.
Excuse me, that village there?
Yeah.
In some of the old writings, they talk about the Great Village or Grand Village. Is that what that is?
No, the Grand Village is the Natchez Village near Natchez. And that was, these are different pieces way out to the west. This would have been out near Texarkana, on the border between Texas and Arkansas. Here in this area, in the D'Arbonne drainage, we have Coach Hardy investigated 2 places with mounds and associated villages that date probably around 12 to 1400 AD. And one of the Scott Place, which is beneath the lake, I guess, and Lindsay was another one up on the lower end of Corny Bayou. And Joe Saunders, some of you might have known Dr. Joe Saunders, who was at the University of Monroe. I worked with Joe and Coach Hardy on some of these sites, and he worked with me on a couple of others. But we've looked at these. Some of them are pretty interesting. The most spectacular is a place called Three Creeks. It's up near Junction City. It's up on the upper end of Corny Bayou. It's an amazing place. And it's out there in the woods that, you know, it's so far out there in the woods and it's hard to get to, but the landowner's crabby old guy that would shoot people if they, you know, but he let us in there, and we did some mapping and a little bit of archaeological work. This is a LiDAR image, which a LiDAR is a satellite. Nowadays they can do satellite imagery that basically gets elevation data that's incredibly detailed. And so you make these little models of the landscape that are, it's amazing. But you can see the mounds. There's 5 mounds that are arranged in a kind of a semicircle sitting on this edge of the floodplain there up in the uplands. And this place is it's impossible to photograph because you're in the woods and you can't get a good idea. But this is a map that we made, a model of a map, a computer model with our elevation data. And you can see how they're big flat top mounds. These mounds probably had structures on them and not human burials in them. They probably, sometimes we call them temple mounds. They had special kinds of structures on top of them. What we've done is just doing some coring, and basically this is Thurman Allen. He worked for the Soil Conservation Service, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service now it's called. But there's a coring truck. We've had something mounted on the back of a four-wheeler actually, and you could drive a tube down into the ground and then pull that out, and you don't disturb hardly anything, but you can get the sequence of different kinds of soils that were constructed to make up that mound. And if you're lucky, you get charcoal that you can do a radiocarbon date. Unfortunately, on this site, we weren't lucky. We didn't get anything to date. But we did recover some pottery, and we know that, again, it dates the same time as Lindsay and Scott Place, maybe about 12 to 1400 AD. There was a lot going on in the Darbone drainage at that time, several big mound sites. These are just a depiction of how we map out those cores. Okay, just a little bit more. Hang in there. We're into historic times. In this area, one of the things about this area here is we're on the border of two different culture areas, and we can kind of depict culture areas in these later prehistoric times because the pottery looks different, some of the houses looks different. But the Caddo people who were to the west were basically in the Red River drainage, and they were different culturally than the people in the lower Mississippi Valley. And the Washita is kind of, more lower Mississippi Valley-like. As you get up the Washita into Arkansas, however, it looks more Caddo. So we're on the border here. And Bayou-Darbone is very difficult. Some of the pottery looks like it's Caddo stuff. Some of it looks like it's lower Mississippi Valley stuff. It's just, it's all kind of mixed up. In historic times, the same way. We had the Tensaw people we know coming over from the lower Mississippi Valley use this area. And also the Washita was a group of Caddo people who also inhabited some of the hills between the Red and the Washita rivers. So it was peoples from different areas used this area. Historically, we had those people were gone in the early 1700s. And in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Choctaw people moved in from Mississippi who were displaced by the English colonists who were coming over into the area. And so we had a number of Choctaw groups that came into this area, including this. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a cool map. It's the William Darby map from 1816, one of the earliest good maps of Louisiana. It mapped the whole state. But you can see Fort Miro here, which would be where Monroe is now. And just a little bit to the west is a little symbol there, and it says Choctaw Village. So there was a village right there. And just a little bit west of Monroe. You can see Darbone, this area up here is nothing. At that time, in 1816, there was practically nobody here. I mean, there was probably people used it as hunting grounds and so on and so forth, but there wasn't any settled villages, at least that the map maker were known to the map maker or to the village folks in this area. I believe that's all I have.
Caddo people.
The Caddo people, what happened is they sort of, when I say the Caddo people, it's really a diverse group of different folks. And there was the Hassanai people that were in East Texas, and the Caddo Adacho who were from Shreveport up to Texarkana along the Red River. They sort of consolidated in the early 1800s. And they had a village near Shreveport, and they signed the Caddo Treaty in 1835. They were sort of forced to sign the Caddo Treaty in 1835. They moved them into Texas, and Texans kicked them out and moved them up into Oklahoma. So the Caddo folks, the Caddo Nation is headquartered near Binger, Oklahoma, west of Oklahoma City. And they still got a great organization. There's thousands of, several thousands on their tribal rolls. So they're still around, but they're not in Louisiana anymore. One of the things I guess I forgot to mention, I have one more slide. In fact, you just reminded me of that. I forgot that I put this in here. Salt was an incredibly interesting, important thing. The Indians didn't really need too much salt in prehistoric times because they got plenty of it from meat and fish that they ate. But once they started growing corn and relying on the corn, you don't get the sodium in your diet that you need. So they started to work salt licks. And here's a picture of the eastern United States. And you can see the couple areas where salt is very prevalent, lots of salt licks. One of them is right here, right in the northern part of Louisiana. Yes, indeed, and it's a salt dome that is just because of the weight of the earth, it kind of squeezes up a dome of salt, and sometimes it'll reach the surface. And as it hits the surface, there'll be little pond areas where you get salty water, and that's how they process the salt. And the Indians did. This is on Lake Bistineau, in the upper part of Lake Bistineau. We call it Potter's Pond, but you can see the circular area right here. That's the top of a salt dome. And around the side, it's just loaded with broken pieces of pottery. You can't walk on that without breaking the pottery. There's so much of it. And it's all bowls like this, all little bowls. And it was the Indians who came in there probably in the late 1600s, the early 1700s, and working the salt dome. This is a little stream that feeds in there. You can see how it's salt encrusted in that little stream. But one of the reasons might be horses and cattle, livestock. Not only do people crave salt, but the livestock does. So you had a market. They were trading, the Indians, both the Caddos and the eastern people were trading salt all over the place, especially to the French and the colonists, because they needed it for the livestock. And so that became a big commodity. I mean, it was an important part of the economy at that time, was trading salt. I have one more slide that I put in here. This is Tom mentioned the Louisiana Archaeology Society and maybe starting a chapter here. The society is just a statewide organization where there's about 5 little groups across the state, and they do little projects, visit sites, and have presentations. And so, if there's enough interest here, if you're interested, I think he's got some sign-up things like that. We'll just see how much interest, and maybe we can start a chapter of the society here where you can get speakers to come in, and sometimes, then you can also get people to come in and share, the things that you found and say, oh, look at this and look at that. It's just a way of pooling your information and seeing what's out there. So anyway, that's something to think about. And okay. Well, thank you.